It was a quiet Sunday morning at Franklin's Diner, a local staple known for its strong coffee and even stronger sense of community. The booths were nearly full, with regulars catching up over pancakes and hash browns. At one corner table sat two men in their late 40s, both wearing casual jeans, military ball caps, and light jackets with patches that hinted at decades of service. James Carter and Luis Moreno, both decorated veterans who had served overseas, were laughing over a shared memory when the atmosphere shifted. A uniformed officer entered the diner. At first, no one paid attention. But instead of heading to the counter or making small talk with the staff, the officer walked directly toward the two veterans. "You two been here long?" the officer asked, his tone sharp and suspicious. James looked up, puzzled. "Just finishing breakfast." "Problem?" "You fit the description," the officer muttered, glancing at a notepad without offering details. "Need to see some ID." Luis raised an eyebrow. "We're just eating, officer." "What's this about?" The room grew quiet. Patrons lowered their forks. Phones discreetly began recording. The officer didn't answer. He stepped closer, hand resting near his holster. James calmly placed his utensils down. "Sir, we've served this country for over 20 years. We're not looking for trouble. But you're making a scene." The officer's tone escalated. "I don't care who you are, if you've got nothing to hide, show your ID." From a nearby booth, a teenage girl whispered to her mom, "Why is he only talking to them?" Luis turned his head and quietly said to James, "This is starting to feel all too familiar." And then, someone spoke up. A woman from another table, phone still recording, stood up and said loud enough for the whole diner to hear, "Officer, they've been here since before I walked in. They haven't done anything. You're harassing them." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Mind your business." But the woman didn't back down. And neither did the camera. The tension in the diner thickened. The officer took a step back, visibly irritated by the growing attention. More phones were now pointed in his direction. The once cozy diner had turned into a stage, and everyone was watching. James leaned forward, voice steady. "Sir, again, we're veterans. We've done nothing wrong. We're asking you, respectfully, to explain why we're being targeted." The officer didn't answer the question. Instead, he looked around the room as if searching for backup, but all he found were disapproving stares and raised eyebrows. Luis calmly pulled out his wallet and laid his veteran ID on the table. "There. Anything else?" Still, the officer wasn't satisfied. "You think that gives you a free pass?" A low murmur rippled through the crowd. James stood up, not aggressively, but tall, proud, and firm. "We don't need a free pass. We earned our peace. You don't get to stomp on it." The waitress, Sandra, a middle-aged woman who'd been working at the diner for over 15 years, stepped in. "Officer, I know both of them. They come here every Sunday. They're polite, they tip well, and they've never caused a single problem." The officer pointed toward the door. "You want to keep interfering, lady?" That's when a second voice cut through the noise. From the entrance. "Actually, officer," the voice said calmly, "I'd advise you to stop right there." All heads turned. A man in a gray blazer with a badge clipped to his belt stood at the door. "I'm Internal Affairs. I've been watching everything, and so has that camera above the register." The officer froze. Luis whispered, "Now we're getting somewhere." The officer's demeanor shifted instantly. His bravado drained the moment he recognized the badge, and the man behind it. "Internal Affairs," he muttered, stepping back. The man in the blazer walked in slowly, authoritative and calm. "Detective Coleman. I've been monitoring citizen complaints from this precinct for weeks. And based on several tips, I decided to observe a few interactions personally. Imagine my surprise walking in on this one." He gestured toward the surveillance camera above the register. The officer stammered, I was just following up on a report." Coleman raised a hand. "A report with no description, no context, and conveniently aimed at two retired veterans having coffee? Spare me." The diner was dead silent, except for the quiet hum of a phone still recording. James remained standing, arms crossed, his voice low but powerful. "This isn't the first time someone in uniform treated us like criminals instead of citizens. But it might be the first time someone actually holds them accountable." Luis nodded. "We're not asking for special treatment, just basic respect." Sandra the waitress added, "Amen to that." Coleman looked toward the officer. "You're relieved of duty. Leave your badge and firearm with me. You'll be placed on administrative review, effective immediately." The officer stood frozen, until Coleman repeated, "Now." Hesitantly, the officer removed his gear and handed it over. Phones captured every second. And then the unexpected happened. The entire diner erupted in applause. The officer, now stripped of his badge and weapon, walked out of the diner in silence. No one spoke to him. No one defended him. The only sound was the ding of the door as it closed behind him. James sat back down, exhaling slowly. "Well, that was one hell of a breakfast." Luis chuckled, but his expression was still tight. "We came in for pancakes. Got served a side of justice." Detective Coleman sat down across from them. "Gentlemen, I want to personally apologize. You shouldn't have been treated like that. It's unacceptable." James nodded. "We appreciate you stepping in. But honestly, if those phones weren't recording, I don't know how this would have ended." One of the younger patrons approached, still holding his phone. "Hey, do you guys mind if I post this online? People need to see what actually happened here." James and Luis exchanged glances, then James replied, "Go ahead. Maybe it'll make someone think twice before doing what that officer just did." Within hours, the video hit social media. The clip of the confrontation, the moment the officer was removed, and the applause that followed, all captured and uploaded with the title, "Veterans Harassed by Cop, but then Justice Walked In." By the next morning, the video had over 4 million views. News anchors discussed it. Veterans organizations reposted it. And the police department? They issued a public statement. But that was just the beginning. By Monday morning, Franklin's diner was swarmed, not by angry officers or reporters, but by supporters. Dozens of community members showed up to thank James and Luis, shake their hands, and quietly pick up their tabs. News vans parked outside. The local morning shows aired live interviews with Sandra the waitress and even Detective Coleman, who, for the first time publicly, confirmed an ongoing investigation into multiple complaints against the now suspended officer. The police chief called a press conference. Standing behind the podium with folded notes, she cleared her throat and said, "We deeply respect the service of every veteran and every citizen in this community. What happened in that diner does not reflect the values of this department. We are cooperating fully with internal affairs, and effective immediately, we are introducing new bias training protocols and community oversight panels." James and Luis weren't there. They didn't want to become symbols or martyrs. But back at the diner, they sat in their usual booth, quietly sipping coffee and watching it all unfold on TV. Luis leaned over. "Think we'll ever get back to a peaceful Sunday breakfast?" James grinned. "Only if they stop playing our video on every channel." They both laughed, but they knew something had changed. Not just for them, but for the entire town. A week later, things began to settle down, but not fade away. Veterans groups reached out from across the country. Some offered speaking opportunities. Others simply sent letters, thanking James and Luis for standing firm in the face of public humiliation. One message read, "You didn't just speak for yourselves, you spoke for all of us who've been treated like we don't belong in the country we served." Franklin's diner. Business was booming. But Sandra had taped a printed sign to the door, "Respect is served here, no exceptions. Detective Coleman visited again, not for business this time, but to join James and Louise at their booth. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "Not everyone stands up when something's wrong. You did. And because of that, policies are changing, not just here, but across the state." James nodded. "We didn't do it for attention. We just wanted it to stop." Luis raised his mug. "Well, maybe we started something." The three men clinked their coffee cups together. Outside, a teenager passed by the diner, paused, and pointed up at the security camera. "That's the place," he whispered to his friend. "That's where those two vets stood their ground." And just like that, a quiet act of defiance became a symbol, not of resistance, but of dignity, justice, and the power of being seen. 2 months later, the video was still circulating, now with over 22 million views across platforms. Major outlets had picked it up, and national conversations had started about how veterans, and everyday citizens, are treated when no one expects them to push back. Franklin's Diner had unofficially become a symbol of community accountability. On the wall behind the register, Sandra hung a framed screenshot from the viral video, the moment James stood tall, eyes locked with the officer, surrounded by silent diners watching history unfold. Below the image, she placed a plaque: "Courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, it just finishes its coffee and stands up." James and Louise kept their routine simple: Sunday breakfast, light banter, occasional interviews they reluctantly agreed to when pressed. But one day, a high school teacher brought her students in for a civics field trip. She approached the two veterans cautiously. "Would you mind saying a few words to my class about what it means to stand up when something feels wrong?" James looked at Louise, then at the class, then smiled. "Sure," he said. "But only if you let us finish our bacon first." The class laughed, and then listened. Because the moment was no longer just about that one day in the diner. It was about every moment after, when someone chose to stand, to record, to speak, and to refuse to stay silent. The ripple effects of the diner incident didn't stop with headlines and hashtags. Within 3 months, city officials announced the creation of a Veteran Citizen Review Board, the first of its kind in the state. James and Louise were invited to serve as honorary advisors. Though hesitant at first, they accepted under one condition: "We don't want to just sit on a board. We want to make sure what happened to us doesn't happen to someone without a camera." Detective Coleman backed the initiative, calling it long overdue. Officers began undergoing new accountability training, not just the usual legal checkboxes, but real discussions with veterans, community leaders, and everyday civilians. And something unexpected happened. Some officers, younger ones especially, started showing up at Franklin's Diner too. Not to enforce, not to watch, but to talk. To listen. One Saturday morning, a rookie approached James and nervously asked, "Sir, could I buy your coffee? My dad served, and he told me to always thank people like you." James looked at him, saw the sincerity, and nodded. "Only if you sit down and drink one with me." They did. Louise, watching from across the table, quietly smiled. Never thought this old diner would turn into a peace table. It had. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But change was real, and growing. Because one confrontation, caught on camera, had become a blueprint for something bigger. By the 6-month mark, what started as a tense diner standoff had evolved into something far greater: a shift in mindset, both within the department and the town. Local schools invited James and Louise to speak regularly, not just about their military service, but about dignity, courage, and how to use your voice without raising it. Kids listened. Parents thanked them afterward. Even teens who usually tuned out everything stayed glued to their seats when Louise told them, "The camera didn't make us brave. It just made others finally pay attention." Meanwhile, Franklin's Diner became a pilgrimage spot. Travelers, veterans, and even influencers stopped by to take photos at the now famous booth. Sandra eventually renamed it, the Honor Table. But perhaps the most telling sign of transformation came from within the force. Detective Coleman oversaw a mentorship program that paired young officers with community members. One of the first recruits. The rookie who'd once nervously offered to buy James a coffee. Now, he led dialogue sessions, voluntarily. At the town hall's next quarterly meeting, Coleman addressed the packed chamber. Accountability isn't about punishment. It's about trust. And if two veterans at a diner can spark a nationwide conversation, imagine what we could do if we all showed up like they did. The room erupted in applause. James and Louise sat in the front row, quiet as always, their presence speaking louder than any headline. Because this was never about going viral. It was about being seen, and refusing to be invisible ever again. A year had passed since that unforgettable morning at Franklin's diner. What began as an unjust confrontation had reshaped an entire town, and inspired others far beyond it. National veteran organizations highlighted the story as a case study in peaceful resistance. Police departments across 3 neighboring states requested copies of the surveillance footage and community-led reform plans. Colleges even began citing the event in their criminal justice courses. But for James and Louise, life hadn't changed all that much, and that's exactly how they wanted it. They still showed up every Sunday morning, sat at the same booth, and ordered the same thing: black coffee, eggs over easy, and enough stories between them to fill another war journal. One morning, a teenage girl approached their table, shyly holding her phone. "Mr. Carter. Mr. Moreno. My dad said you're the reason he stayed on the force. He said watching what happened to you made him want to be better." James looked at her, stunned. Louise offered a soft smile. "Tell your dad we said thank you," James replied. "And tell him, we're watching too." The girl giggled, then walked away, but not before snapping a quick photo. The story had come full circle. Not because justice had been perfectly served. But because a simple moment, 2 men, 1 camera, and a diner full of truth, had proven that even quiet heroes can change the course of history. And sometimes, all it takes, is one person pressing record. 2 weeks after the 1-year anniversary, something unexpected arrived in the mail for James and Louise, an invitation from the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C. The letter read, "In recognition of your service to the nation, and your courage in standing for justice in a moment that inspired millions, we invite you to speak at this year's National Veterans Leadership Summit." James held the letter in silence. Louise raised an eyebrow. "You ever given a speech before?" James smirked. "Does chewing out a lieutenant in '03 count?" They accepted the invite. At the summit, held in a massive hall filled with thousands of service members, lawmakers, and young cadets, they took the stage side by side. Louise spoke first. "You know, no one wakes up hoping to go viral in a diner." Laughter. But then silence as James added, "We served overseas, but the hardest battles we ever faced happened in our own backyard, being questioned for existing, for sitting down, for breathing. That morning wasn't about fame. It was about fairness." He paused. "And if that moment made even one person think twice before misusing their power, then it was worth it." Thunderous applause. Later, after the event, a senior official approached them and said, "Gentlemen, you reminded the nation what it looks like when honor wears civilian clothes." Back home, Sandra saved every article, screenshot, and news clipping. She created a wall inside the diner, the day everything changed. And just beneath the final framed headline, she placed a small sign, "Real heroes don't wait for medals, they make moments matter." Years later, Franklin's diner still stood, now with a fresh coat of paint, upgraded booths, and one particular table forever reserved with a plaque that simply read, "James Louise, Veterans. Neighbors. Legends." Sandra had retired, but her daughter ran the diner now, keeping her mother's spirit alive, and the story that transformed their town. Tourists still visited. Reporters still asked for quotes. Students still wrote essays about the diner incident. But the men at the center of it had moved on quietly, without fanfare. James had started mentoring young men through a local outreach program. Luis opened a small workshop, teaching skills to veterans re-entering civilian life. Both avoided the spotlight, even as their story lived on without them. One spring afternoon, a local documentary crew returned to the diner. They wanted to film a follow-up. But when they arrived, they found something unexpected. A young police officer and a teenage boy, a cadet in training, were sitting at the honor table, deep in conversation. No phones. No cameras. Just two people listening to each other. The director turned to his assistant and said, "That's the shot. That's the legacy." Because the true ending wasn't the video or the viral moment. It was this, a community rebuilt from the inside out. Trust restored, not by force, but by example. And two veterans who reminded the world that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do, is simply sit down, stay calm, and stand your ground.